Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, but it's also a massive challenge. You've been having the most inspiring conversations today for a long time, and I was witnessing some of those heated debates, and I hope I can keep your attention up for another little while. And what I offer to do in this keynote speech is a little case study in German politics, because we can talk about just transition in the most abstract possible way, and we'll be all happy and feel intellectually stimulated. But I believe it's of fundamental importance to really understand where the difficulties are when it comes to realizing a just transition. So my talk will be very heavy on German politics and on policy as well. However, not only in Germany, across Europe and even across the world, climate has become the new reference point in political discourse. Thanks to the courageous and relentless action by civil society, all established political parties in Germany, but also in many other Western countries, have had to take a stance on climate. Thanks to Fridays for Future and their allies, climate has made it to the top of the political agenda. And here's the proof. The leader of the German Conservative Party, the CDU, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, does not get tired to say that climate really is part of the DNA of the CDU. We've been dealing with sustainability for a very long time. The German Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister Olaf Scholz reminded us just a few weeks ago that, quote, we need to be bold when it comes to climate policy if our government is to keep its license to run the country. Equally, Alexander Dobrindt of the Bavarian CSU is convinced that the protection of creation is part of the genetic code of Christian conservative politics. Now you laugh, but let's take on the challenge. I do. But also, and that's maybe of a more serious note, then the head of the German Services Trade Union, Frank Wernicke, declared just last week the protection of nature is part of the history of the trade union movement, and our commitment to this cause is part of our tradition. Now, as people who care about the climate, we can react in a number of ways. On the one hand, we can be thrilled that climate has finally become the defining issue of contemporary politics. On the other, we might be nothing less than aghast, given the empty formulas of political discourse we're being subject to on a daily basis, and the lack of any serious effort to transform our economy and to make it future-proof. Now, many people in my immediate environment veer to the latter. The policies and measures that the German government, and some of you might have followed this, just produced to cut emissions until the year 2030 simply do not even remotely reflect the scale of the challenge. Germany needs to cut something like 250 million tons of CO2 by 2030, but the proposed collection of measures will deliver only a third at best. The suggested price of CO2 of 10 euros per ton is way too low to have any effects. And this is an example of the very politics of incrementalism that my friend and colleague Hanno talked about this morning. What we're sorely missing is a systemic approach, including, for example, the end of subsidies for fossil fuels, and a system of taxes and levies that is based on greenhouse gas emissions. An approach, perhaps, that reflects the scale of the damage that greenhouse gases are causing, without, however, making the poor pay for the emissions of the rich. And this is where it's getting pretty difficult, because we will have to scrap privileges, we will have to price out business models that are destroying our future, and which politician really is ready to stand up for such positions? Clearly, ambitious climate policy is difficult and complex. You've been discussing all day how our democracy is not fit for purpose, how politics does not produce solutions any longer, how politics is broken, how societies are increasingly polarized, and how trust in institutions keeps eroding further and further. But the case for climate policy has never been an easy one. We may remember arguments about lacking technical feasibility when it comes to the integration of renewables into the electricity grid, about the negative impacts on competitiveness if higher environmental standards are introduced or if energy prices are increased. And most recently, policymakers have been talking about the incompatibility of climate policy with social justice. Now we're approaching the topic of a just transition. Most of these concerns are exaggerated. Some of them are even imagined, I would contend. I would even go as far as to say that officials are afraid of an imagined blowback by the public in response to the introduction of ambitious climate action. In other words, in the case of Germany, the specter of a German equivalent of the Yellow Vest movement has been sitting around the decision-making table when climate policies were discussed recently. At the same time, however, and we all know this, there are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets protesting peacefully and demanding a responsible climate policy from the government. Their protests stand for measures that are not by definition socially unjust. They are demanding a deep transformation of the economic system, one that tackles climate alongside social cohesion, civic empowerment, and pluralist values. I believe that the notion of a just transition encapsulates many of these demands. And it also offers very practical ways of achieving the transition to a zero-carbon economy in a socially sustainable way. Now, a just transition is primarily about the livelihoods of workers and communities who are disproportionately affected by this transition because they depend on carbon and energy-intensive industries, because they stand to lose their jobs and their economic base. But delaying or shunning the transition altogether is not an option, of course. And I want to remind everyone of one of my favorite quotes by Sharon Burrows, the head of the International Trade Union Conference. She put it a few years ago as the following: there are no jobs on a dead planet. By definition, a just transition is about an active state. A state that provides very clear regulatory frameworks on the permitted amount of emissions for all sectors of the economy in a given period of time. But it's also about a state that makes sure that the burdens of climate policy are distributed fairly in society. Co-workers, for instance, need to be given a fair chance to reinvent themselves after their jobs are gone. They need retraining facilities so they can find new, decent jobs in the future. They deserve social protection if they fail to land new jobs. A just transition also makes sure that poorer households with a lower carbon footprint do not have to subsidize the decarbonization of heavy polluters and big industry. Regions that currently depend on highly polluting industries like coal, or industries in transformation like the automotive industry, must not be left to their own devices. These regions require active public interventions, and in particular, investments in infrastructure and public services to become attractive to new, clean industries and private investors. Now, a little case study. Many of you might know the work of the German Coal Commission in the last year. I guess the work of this commission comes close to something like best practice of what a just transition might look like. And I know, nothing is ever perfect, not even in this country. The commission was composed of elected politicians, of coal companies, trade unions, environmental NGOs, and scientists. They worked together for many months to decide on a pathway for a coal phase-out in Germany, but also the necessary support for the affected coal mining regions. And all members did manage to agree on a common position in the end. I concede 40 billion euros for Germany's coal mining regions in the next 20 years to support the transition. It's a lot of money that will certainly be lacking elsewhere. One might also ask that the number of jobs that need to be replaced really justify the sum. After all, there are only about 20,000 active workers in the coal industry left. But this is a consensus that people manage to produce. And true, the final date for coal phase-out in the year 2038 is way too late. But even if the outcome is not perfect, it does have legitimacy. And it has the potential to bring about a managed transition out of coal. And it shows, I guess, that climate and social can go hand in hand. Similar efforts of commissions discussing and deciding on the future of coal are emerging elsewhere as well, like in the Czech Republic, for example. And I guess we will likely see even more of such endeavors because of the sheer economics of coal. When some of you might know, the CEO of the largest power utility in Europe, Francesco Starace, said recently that renewables would end the economic viability of coal within the next 10 years. So in Germany, we'll likely have to review the coal phase-out date, but we might also have to replicate the exercise of the Coal Commission for other sectors. The transformation of the automotive industry will be even more challenging, even more painful, not least from a social justice and labor point of view. After all, there are 800,000 jobs in this sector in Germany. There are good practice examples, by the way, from the financial crisis more than 10 years ago, where trade unions were able to prevent job losses by introducing new work schemes in companies. In many cases, all employees, including the management, cut their working hours in solidarity so everyone could keep their jobs. So there was enough money available for everyone to get some kind of a decent pay. And these kinds of measures might be necessary again, despite the fact that this is not about transformational politics. It's really hard to separate the two. But of course, coal and cars are just the tip of the iceberg, as our entire economic and financial system needs an overhaul. We need a Just Transition 2.0, which is transformational, radical, and democratically rooted. And despite the best practice examples I just mentioned, I also need to introduce a major note of caution. The progressive idea of the just transition is now being used as an excuse for politics of but. The notion of a just transition has been captured. Social justice has become an argument to prevent the very transformation we need. In this country, we could witness this just recently. In reaction to the climate package I mentioned in the beginning, the Green Party demanded a range of improvements, such as a much higher price for CO2 of 40 euros per ton of carbon. The revenue from CO2 pricing would then be handed back to citizens, 100 euros per person per year. And the idea was that this would benefit lower-income households disproportionately, as their energy consumption tends to be lower. Now, in a, let's call it knee-jerk reaction, essentially all the other political parties were quick to demonize these propositions as autocratic, that was the Free Democratic Party, anti-liberal, although that's my rather liberal translation of the German term Verbotspartei, that was from the CSU in Bavaria, and simply unreasonable, that was our economics minister. The chairman of the Social Democrats in the German Bundestag took on the Greens and criticized them for acting in a neoliberal way, because their voters tend to have higher incomes. Similarly, the chairman of the Left Party accused the Greens of clientelist politics that only serve the affluent part of society. And isn't it ironic? There has just been a real window of opportunity to develop a climate policy that is both effective and socially just. And now we don't even have serious climate policy, and yet we witness fear-mongering about the costs of climate action, including in the political left. This comes at a clear risk of victimization at a time when we really need a politics of empowerment. In a similar way, conservatives like the Bavarian Prime Minister are warning that social peace might be at risk when climate policies become too bold. And Wolfgang Kubicki of the neoliberal FDP argues very similarly that the rigorism of the climate movement will lead to violence as a means of resolving conflict. And it's just interesting in this context that the movement Extinction Rebellion believes that the breakdown of society will be the very result of the climate crisis. Now, I believe that we need to reclaim the idea of a just transition. We have to continue to work on a vision of policies for a transformation that is socially just. Now I'm getting mixed up here. I guess it's about time that the transformation we need goes beyond the level of political rhetoric. And therefore, I also want to say a few things about the real-world opportunities of a transformational approach to the climate and ecological crisis. So first of all, a managed, a just transition can bring about completely new business models and job opportunities. I'm talking the policy language here, which we so badly need in this discussion as well. According to the OECD, the net effects of the transition to a zero-carbon economy on global GDP will likely be positive. The German Federal Environment Agency expects 1.5 million new jobs that are climate compatible in this country. And if trade unions get involved to make sure that these new jobs are unionized, they can play an active part in the transition, and they can make sure that green jobs are also decent jobs. This likely won't happen by itself. Such a positive outcome will only be possible, though, if the transition is not left to market forces alone. We need an active state whose education system prepares young people for the jobs of the future, that provides regulatory certainty, and that invests in infrastructure that is climate compatible, climate resilient, and that enables the transition. All of this costs money. The European Commission estimates that the additional funding required in order for the zero-carbon transition to happen is in the range of 180 billion euros per year, on top of the investments that are taking place already. Other estimates go even beyond that. Now, since a lot of this money will have to go into new and unproven technologies, unproven business models even, private companies may find it really difficult to convince their banks to give them a loan, even in this time of excess money at close to zero costs. And again, we need an active state that guarantees loans for new technologies, for example, in the area of power to X. So, as much as I love talking about things like empowerment and democratic ownership, we also need to take the real economy and the financial sector along. Fortunately, a lot is happening already, especially in the financial sector. Investments are being diverted away from brown projects and investments. They're being redirected into green and sustainable investments. It's just not enough yet, but the concepts are there. And this shows that just transition is the biggest transformational, potentially the biggest transformational project ever. And it's one that requires an active role by pretty much all forces of society and all parts of government. It does not belong to any actor in society. It does not belong to any government ministry, not to the environment, not to the economics ministry. It needs to be owned and shaped by the ministries of finance, development, social and labor affairs, and so on. And by the way, it also needs to be co-owned by foreign ministries. And who wants to know more about this, I strongly recommend that you have a look at the policy paper of the Progressive Center that we just published a few weeks ago. Now, in this room, we have the people working in these government institutions I just mentioned. We have the people who do the public engagement that's necessary. We've got people doing research, people doing the politics of the transition. We all play a critical role in this process. And Hanno, as you put it this morning, we are all game changers. And we can all co-create a sustainable future. And I would hope that this message doesn't stay in this room, but that you take it along to your workplace and that eventually it will also make it into the political mainstream of this country.